And the thing is, once you carry that lingering unease from the trailer into the actual story, the opening stretch doesn't rush to reassure you. It leans into it, almost stubbornly. The film takes its time reconnecting you with that same child, Cataleya, and instead of softening the edges, it sharpens them. You're dropped back into that moment of chaos, but now you're noticing details you might have missed the first time around. The way she processes fear, the way she moves not like a kid panicking, but like someone already adapting. There's a precision to her escape that feels unsettling. She isn't lucky, she's observant. And that's an important distinction because it quietly tells you this isn't a transformation story waiting to happen. The seeds are already there. When she navigates through the city, slipping past danger with this eerie focus, it doesn't feel like a stretch when she eventually grows into the version of herself we saw in the trailer. It feels inevitable, which is honestly more disturbing than inspiring. By the time she reaches the United States, the film shifts its atmosphere again. Everything becomes colder, more structured, less chaotic on the surface. But that chaos hasn't disappeared. It's just been internalized. Her uncle becomes a key figure here, not in a sentimental way, but as someone who recognizes what she's becoming and makes a very conscious decision about how to handle it. There's no illusion of saving her childhood. That window is already closed. What he offers instead is direction, discipline, and, in a strange way, permission. And that relationship is complicated. It's not nurturing in the traditional sense, and it's definitely not moral, but it's grounded in a kind of realism that fits the world the film is building. He doesn't try to change her motivations, he shapes them. He channels them into something controlled, almost professional. That's where the film starts blending its emotional core with its action framework. Her training isn't just about becoming deadly, it's about becoming invisible, calculated, untouchable. As the years pass and Cataleya fully becomes the woman portrayed by Zoe Saldana, the story doesn't present it as a dramatic reveal. There's no big, "this is who she is now" moment. Instead, it unfolds gradually, through routine. You see how she operates, how she prepares, how she executes. There's a rhythm to it that feels almost clinical. Every step has a purpose, and every action feeds into a larger plan that's been quietly building for years. What's fascinating is how the film handles her double life. On one side, she's this highly efficient assassin, leaving behind carefully constructed signatures after each hit. Messages that aren't meant for the world, but for one specific person. On the other side, she maintains a version of normalcy, interacting with people who have no idea what she really is. And that contrast isn't played for irony or humor. It's played straight, almost uncomfortably so, because you're constantly aware that one side is slowly eroding the other. There's a particular tension in those quieter scenes, where she tries to exist like a regular person. You can feel the disconnect. It's not that she doesn't want connection. It's that she doesn't know how to exist within it without compromising the thing that's been driving her for so long. And that's where the film starts to blur the line between mission and identity. Revenge isn't just something she's pursuing. It's become the structure of her entire life. Meanwhile, the people she's targeting aren't just random criminals. There's a pattern, a deliberate escalation that suggests she's working her way up a chain. Each hit is a step closer to something larger, something more personal. And the film doesn't rush through these moments. It lingers just enough to show you the planning, the patience, the control. You're not watching chaos, you're watching design. But there's also a growing sense that this design isn't sustainable. The more precise her actions become, the more attention they attract. Law enforcement starts to notice the pattern, starts to connect the dots, even if they don't fully understand what they're looking at yet. And that adds another layer of pressure, because now it's not just about reaching her target, it's about staying ahead of a system that's slowly closing in. What I appreciate here is that the film doesn't turn that into a cat and mouse game in the traditional sense. It's more subtle than that. The authorities aren't portrayed as incompetent obstacles. They're methodical, persistent, and gradually becoming more aware. That creates a kind of background tension that never fully explodes, but constantly simmers beneath the surface. At the same time, her personal life begins to complicate things in ways she can't fully control. Relationships start to form, or at least attempt to, and each one introduces a new variable into a system that was originally designed to have none. And you can see the cracks forming, not in her abilities, but in her structure. The more she tries to compartmentalize, the harder it becomes to keep those compartments from bleeding into each other. And that's where the story starts to feel less like a straightforward revenge narrative and more like a slow collision between two incompatible lives. On one side, there's the mission, clear, focused, consuming. On the other, there's the possibility of something resembling normalcy, fragile and uncertain. The film doesn't present one as better than the other. It just shows how difficult it is to hold on to both without losing something in the process. All of this builds quietly, almost deceptively, because on the surface, the film is still delivering what you'd expect: action, tension, momentum. But underneath, there's this ongoing question about whether the end goal is even going to mean anything once she reaches it. And the closer she gets, the more that question starts to matter. And the closer she gets, the more the film starts tightening everything around her without ever announcing it out loud. There's no dramatic shift in tone, no obvious turning point. It just gradually becomes harder for her to move the way she used to. Spaces feel smaller, time feels shorter. Even her routines, which once looked almost flawless, begin to carry this faint sense of risk. What really stands out in this stretch is how the film treats consequences. Not in a moralizing way, not in a crime doesn't pay kind of message, but in a very practical, almost logistical sense. Every action she takes now has weight, and that weight accumulates. The signatures she leaves behind, those orchid drawings, start doing exactly what they were meant to do. They draw attention. But attention isn't something you can control once it spreads. It doesn't just reach her target. It reaches everyone else looking for patterns, for anomalies, for anything that doesn't fit. So while she's getting closer to the man responsible for everything that happened to her family, there's this parallel movement happening where law enforcement is getting closer to her. And the film plays that tension in a really restrained way. It doesn't cut back and forth constantly to remind you. Instead, it lets the awareness build in the background, like a pressure system you can't quite see, but definitely feel. At the same time, her personal connection, the one fragile thread tying her to something resembling a normal life, starts to shift. It's no longer just an escape or a distraction. It becomes a liability. And you can see her recognizing that, even if she doesn't fully admit it. There's a hesitation in her now, a second of pause where there used to be none. It's subtle, but it changes the rhythm of everything she does. And that's where the film becomes less about precision and more about inevitability. Because once hesitation enters the equation, the system she built for herself, this perfectly controlled, perfectly isolated existence, starts to destabilize. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in small, accumulating ways that you can't ignore. When the story finally pushes her into direct proximity with the people she's been hunting, it doesn't explode into chaos the way you might expect. It's actually quieter than that, more deliberate. There's a sense that this moment has been rehearsed in her mind for years, and now that it's happening, it almost feels contained, focused, like everything else has faded away except this one objective. But even in that focus, there's a shift. You start to see that the thing she's been chasing isn't going to resolve as cleanly as she imagined. The film doesn't spell it out, but it's there in the way she moves, the way she reacts. Revenge, in reality, isn't a perfect circle. It doesn't bring you back to where you started. It just pushes you further into something else. And when the confrontation finally unfolds, it's not framed as a triumphant moment. There's no sense of victory in the traditional cinematic way. It's tense, controlled, and, in a strange way, almost anticlimactic. Not because it lacks intensity, but because it refuses to give you that emotional release you might be expecting. It feels like an endpoint that doesn't actually end anything. What follows is where the film makes its most interesting choice. Instead of wrapping everything up neatly, it lingers in the aftermath. Not in a prolonged, drawn-out way, but just enough to let you sit with what's left. And what's left isn't clarity, it's absence. The driving force that defined her for so long is gone, and the film doesn't immediately replace it with something new. So you're left watching someone who has spent years building herself around a single purpose, now facing the reality of existing without it. And that's not something the film tries to solve. It doesn't offer a clear path forward. It doesn't suddenly transform her into a different kind of person. It just shows you the space where that purpose used to be, and how empty it feels. There's also the lingering question of consequence, not just legally, but personally. The people she's encountered along the way, the relationships she's tried to maintain, the identity she's constructed, none of it simply disappears. It all remains, but it no longer fits together the way it used to. And that creates this quiet, unresolved tension that carries through the final moments. What I find compelling is that the film trusts the audience enough to sit with that ambiguity. It doesn't rush to reassure you. It doesn't try to redefine her in a single scene. It just lets the story end in a way that feels consistent with everything that came before. Controlled, restrained, and a little bit haunting. And when you step back from it, the entire journey starts to look less like a straight line and more like a loop that never quite closes. She set out to complete something, to finish a story that began in violence. And in doing so, she created a new version of herself that can't easily exist outside of that context. So even though the immediate goal is achieved, the larger question, the one about who she is without it, remains open, lingering in a way that stays with you long after the screen fades. It's kind of impossible to separate the release of Colombiana from the moment Hollywood was going through at that time, because the early 2010s had this very specific energy when it came to action films. Studios were experimenting with scale, but also quietly testing how far they could push character-driven narratives within that space. You had big franchises dominating the box office, but alongside them, there was this steady stream of mid-budget action thrillers trying to carve out their own identity. Films that weren't built as cinematic universes, but still aimed to leave a lasting impression. And this movie lands right in the middle of that landscape. It's produced by EuropaCorp, which, if you followed their output, you already know the pattern. They had a knack for delivering these sleek, internationally flavored action films that felt just a little different from standard Hollywood productions. There's a certain polish to them, but also a willingness to center stories around characters who don't always fit the traditional American action hero mold. The release timing, late summer, also says a lot. That's usually a space where studios drop films that they believe can perform solidly without needing the full weight of a blockbuster season. It's competitive, but it's also an opportunity. You're not going head-to-head with the biggest tentpoles, but you're still close enough to that window where audiences are in the mood for spectacle. So a film like this, which blends action with a more personal revenge narrative, can find its audience if it connects. What's interesting is how the industry was starting to shift its perception of female-led action films around that time. Before this, those kinds of projects were often treated as exceptions rather than viable leads in the genre. You'd get standout performances here and there, but they weren't always supported by strong, standalone narratives built entirely around them. And then you start seeing a gradual change. Films beginning to test whether audiences would show up not just for the action, but for the character at the center of it. That's where casting Zoe Saldaña becomes particularly significant. By this point, she had already been part of massive franchises, but here she's carrying the entire film on her shoulders. There's no ensemble to distribute the weight. The marketing leans heavily on her presence, her physicality, her ability to bring both intensity and vulnerability into the same frame. And that's a different kind of challenge compared to being part of a larger cinematic machine. You can also feel the influence of Luc Besson in how the film positions itself within the market. His style, whether you love it or not, has always been about blending emotional trauma with stylized action, often centered around strong female protagonists navigating dangerous worlds. And while he didn't direct this one, the DNA is unmistakable. The film carries that same sense of heightened reality, where everything is just slightly more stylized than real life, but still grounded enough to feel immediate. From a broader industry perspective, this was also a time when globalization in film production was becoming more visible. You have stories that move across countries, characters with international backgrounds, and production teams pulling from different parts of the world. It's not just about setting anymore. It's about creating something that resonates beyond a single market. And Colombiana leans into that, both in its narrative and its aesthetic. Financially, the expectations for a film like this are different from a major franchise. It doesn't need to break records to be considered successful. It needs to perform steadily, find its audience, and ideally build a kind of long-term presence through home viewing, streaming, and international markets. And that's often where these films really prove their value, not just in opening weekend numbers, but in how they hold up over time. Critically, the reception lands somewhere in that familiar middle ground for this kind of project. There's recognition of the lead performance, appreciation for the action sequences, but also some hesitation around how fully the story explores its deeper themes. And honestly, that's not surprising. Films like this often walk a fine line between delivering genre expectations and digging into the psychological weight they hint at. What matters more, in a lot of ways, is how audiences respond. And there's a certain type of viewer who connects with this story, not because it reinvents the genre, but because it commits to its tone. It doesn't try to be overly clever or self-aware. It plays things straight, and for some people, that directness works. Looking back now, you can see how this film fits into a larger pattern. It's part of a wave that helped normalize the idea of female-led action stories as something more than a niche. It didn't single-handedly change the industry, but it contributed to a shift that was already underway. And over time, that shift becomes more visible as more projects build on that foundation. There's also something to be said about how the film has aged within that context. The industry has continued to evolve, budgets have expanded, storytelling approaches have become more ambitious, but there's still a place for this kind of focused, character-driven action film. In fact, there's an argument to be made that audiences sometimes crave it, a break from the scale and complexity of larger franchises. So when you place Colombiana within its release window and the broader industry landscape, it starts to feel less like an isolated project and more like a piece of a larger puzzle. A film that arrived at a moment when the genre was quietly expanding, testing its boundaries, and figuring out what it could become next. What really holds everything together, though, isn't just the structure or the pacing, it's the people inside it. And with a film like Colombiana, you can feel pretty quickly that the casting decisions weren't random. They're doing a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of credibility, even in moments where the script leans into familiar territory. At the center of it all is Zoe Saldaña as Cataleya. And what's interesting about her performance is how restrained it is. She doesn't play the character as outwardly emotional, which could have been the easy route given the backstory. Instead, she internalizes almost everything. You see it in the way she carries herself, shoulders slightly tense, eyes constantly scanning, like she's never fully at rest. Even in scenes that are supposed to feel calm, there's this underlying alertness that never goes away. And that choice matters, because it keeps the character from slipping into cliché. A lot of revenge-driven protagonists are written as either completely consumed by rage or dramatically conflicted at every turn. Here, it's quieter, more controlled. You're not being told what she feels. You're watching someone who has learned to function without openly expressing it. That's a harder performance to pull off than it looks, because it relies on subtle shifts rather than big moments. Then you've got Cliff Curtis as Emilio, her uncle, and his role is one of those understated anchors that the film depends on more than it might initially seem. He's not overly expressive either, but there's a grounded presence to him. You believe that he understands exactly what kind of path Cataleya is on, and instead of trying to stop it, he chooses to manage it. That dynamic, somewhere between protector, mentor, and reluctant enabler, adds a layer of realism to their relationship. What Curtis does particularly well is avoid turning Emilio into a moral compass. He's not there to lecture or redirect her. He operates within the same world, the same set of rules, and that makes his interactions with her feel honest. There's a kind of unspoken agreement between them that the film never spells out, but you can sense it in the way they communicate: brief, direct, efficient. On the other side of Cataleya's life, you have Michael Vartan as Danny, and this is where things get a little more complicated tonally. His character represents that possibility of a normal life, but the film doesn't fully romanticize it. There's an awkwardness to their connection, not in a negative way, but in a way that feels intentional. It's like watching two people exist on completely different emotional wavelengths, trying to find a point where they overlap. Vartan plays that with a kind of grounded sincerity. He doesn't overplay the role, which helps keep it from feeling like a standard romantic subplot. Instead, it becomes another layer of tension. Every interaction between them carries this quiet question: how long can this possibly last? And because the film never fully resolves that question in a conventional way, it adds to that lingering sense of instability in Cataleya's life. Then there's Jordi Moya as Don Luis, the man at the center of Cataleya's long-standing mission. His performance leans more into presence than complexity. He's not written as a deeply layered antagonist, but Moya gives him enough personality to make him feel distinct. There's a certain arrogance in the way he carries himself, a belief in his own untouchability that makes him a fitting target for someone like Cataleya. What's notable is that the film doesn't spend a huge amount of time trying to humanize him, and that's a deliberate choice. The focus remains on Cataleya's perspective. He exists as a force in her story, rather than a fully explored character in his own right. And while that might feel limiting from a narrative standpoint, it keeps the emotional center of the film from drifting. Supporting roles also play their part in shaping the world around these main characters. Law enforcement figures, for example, aren't caricatures. They're portrayed as competent, observant, gradually piecing things together. That adds a layer of credibility to the tension, because it never feels like Cataleya is operating in a vacuum. There are always other forces moving, reacting, adapting. Even the smaller interactions, brief conversations, background characters, fleeting moments, are handled with a certain level of care. Nobody feels completely out of place within the tone of the film, and that consistency helps maintain immersion, especially in a story that relies heavily on atmosphere and mood. But ultimately, everything circles back to Saldana's performance. Because no matter how strong the supporting cast is, this is a film that lives or dies on whether you believe in her as this character. And for the most part, she makes it work. Not by dominating every scene in an obvious way, but by holding a steady, controlled presence that ties everything together. There's a kind of quiet confidence in the way she approaches the role, and it allows the film to take its time without losing focus. You're not being constantly reminded that she's the center of the story. You just feel it. And that's often the mark of a performance that understands exactly what it needs to be, without trying to do more than that. And what's interesting is that once you step away from all those individual performances and just look at how the film presents itself on the surface, it actually plays things a lot simpler than you might expect. Colombiana doesn't try to overwhelm you with complicated mythology or layered timelines. It keeps the framework pretty direct, almost deceptively so, and that's where its accessibility really comes from. At its core, the story follows a woman shaped by a traumatic past, who grows into someone operating in a world defined by precision and danger. That alone isn't new. We've seen variations of that setup across decades of action cinema. But what gives it its identity is the way it blends that familiar structure with a very personal objective. Everything she does, every move she makes, ties back to a single, unresolved moment from her childhood. So even if you strip away the stylistic elements, what you're left with is a character moving through a series of escalating situations, each one bringing her closer to a confrontation that's been years in the making. And the film doesn't complicate that journey unnecessarily. It doesn't introduce multiple conflicting arcs or try to constantly redirect your attention. It stays focused, which, depending on what you're looking for, can either feel refreshingly clear or slightly limiting. There's also a very deliberate balance between action and stillness. The film doesn't operate at a constant high intensity. Instead, it creates space between its major sequences, allowing the character to exist outside of those moments. And those quieter stretches are doing more work than they might initially appear to. They're where you get a sense of routine, of isolation, of the kind of life that exists in between the missions. Because when you think about it, a character like this doesn't just live in action scenes. There are hours, days, weeks where nothing happens externally, and the film tries, at least in part, to acknowledge that. It shows you glimpses of a life that isn't entirely defined by movement, even if that life never fully stabilizes. The structure also leans heavily on progression. Each step forward feels intentional, like part of a larger design. There's a sense that nothing is random, that every action contributes to a bigger picture. And that's where the film maintains its momentum, not through constant escalation, but through the feeling that everything is building towards something specific. At the same time, it avoids over-explaining itself. It trusts the audience to connect the dots, to understand motivations without having them spelled out repeatedly. And that restraint helps maintain a certain level of immersion. You're not being guided through every emotional beat. You're observing them, interpreting them, sometimes even questioning them. What stands out in a spoiler-free sense is how the film handles tension. It doesn't rely solely on large-scale confrontations or dramatic twists. A lot of its tension comes from anticipation, from knowing what the character is capable of, and watching how she navigates situations where that capability might be tested or compromised. There's also an underlying theme of duality that runs through everything. The idea of living two lives, of balancing two identities that aren't meant to coexist. And while the film doesn't dive deeply into that theme in a philosophical way, it uses it effectively as a narrative tool. It creates situations where those two sides begin to overlap, and that overlap becomes a source of conflict. Visually, the film supports this structure by maintaining a consistent tone. It doesn't swing wildly between styles or moods. There's a cohesion to the way scenes are framed, lit, and paced, which helps keep the experience grounded even when the action becomes more stylized. And then there's the pacing, which is probably one of the more defining aspects of the film's overall feel. It doesn't rush, but it doesn't linger unnecessarily either. It moves with a kind of steady confidence, allowing each sequence to play out without feeling stretched or compressed. That balance is difficult to achieve, especially in a genre where there's often pressure to keep things constantly moving. From a broader perspective, the film positions itself as something you can engage with on multiple levels. If you're watching purely for the action, it delivers enough to keep you invested. If you're more interested in character and atmosphere, there's enough there to hold your attention as well. It doesn't fully commit to one over the other, which again can be seen as either a strength or a limitation, depending on your expectations. But perhaps the most defining aspect of its presentation is its consistency. It knows what kind of film it wants to be, and it sticks to that identity without trying to constantly reinvent itself along the way. And in a landscape where many films feel the need to escalate or transform dramatically to maintain interest, there's something quietly confident about that choice. It's not trying to surprise you at every turn. It's trying to guide you through a specific experience, one that's built on tone, character, and a steady sense of progression. And whether or not that approach fully resonates, it gives the film a clear sense of purpose from beginning to end. And once you've taken all of that in, the structure, the performances, the way the story moves, you start to notice where the film really stands on its own, and where it leans on familiar ground. Because Colombiana is one of those movies that sits right in that space between style and substance, never fully committing to one over the other, which makes it interesting to unpack. There's a certain confidence in how it presents action. It doesn't feel chaotic or overly edited. The sequences are clean, readable, and built around movement rather than noise. You can follow what's happening without feeling overwhelmed, and that alone puts it a step above a lot of action films that rely on quick cuts to simulate intensity. Here, the intensity comes from control, from the way scenes are constructed and executed. But at the same time, you can sense that the film is holding something back emotionally. It gives you just enough of Cataleya's internal world to understand her, but not always enough to fully connect with her on a deeper level. And I don't think that's accidental. It feels like a deliberate choice to keep her slightly out of reach, almost like the film is mirroring her own inability to fully open up. That approach works in some moments. It creates a kind of distance that fits the character. You're not meant to feel completely comfortable with her. She's not designed to be easily relatable in a traditional sense. But there are points where you might wish the film pushed just a little further, where it allowed itself to slow down and explore the emotional consequences of her actions in more detail. And that's where the balance becomes tricky. Because every time the film starts to lean into introspection, it pulls itself back toward action. It's almost like it doesn't fully trust the quieter moments to carry the same weight. So instead of fully committing to one direction, it hovers between the two, which can make the overall experience feel slightly restrained. From a visual standpoint, though, there's a lot to appreciate. The film has a distinct look, sleek, controlled, with a consistent use of color and lighting that reinforces its tone. It doesn't go for extreme stylization, but it's far from generic. There's a sense of intention behind how scenes are framed, how space is used, how movement is captured. And that attention to detail helps maintain a cohesive atmosphere throughout. The action choreography also deserves some credit. It's not overly flashy, but it's effective. It feels grounded enough to be believable within the film's world, while still delivering the kind of precision you expect from a character like Cataleya. There's a rhythm to it that matches her personality, efficient, deliberate, never wasting motion. Where the film becomes more divisive, I think, is in its narrative depth. The core idea, a life shaped entirely by revenge, is compelling. But the exploration of that idea doesn't always go as far as it could. You get glimpses of something deeper, hints at a more complex psychological portrait, but the film doesn't fully dive into those areas. It stays closer to the surface, focusing on progression rather than introspection. And that's not necessarily a flaw, depending on what you're looking for. For some viewers, that restraint keeps the film focused and engaging. It doesn't get lost in its own themes. It doesn't slow down to the point where momentum is lost. It maintains a clear sense of direction from start to finish. But for others, it might feel like a missed opportunity. Like there was potential for something more layered, more emotionally resonant, that the film only partially taps into. And that tension between what it is and what it could have been is part of what makes it interesting to discuss. Performance-wise, everything continues to circle back to Zoe Saldaña. She carries the film with a kind of quiet intensity that doesn't demand attention, but naturally draws it. It's not a showy performance. It's controlled, measured, consistent. And that consistency helps anchor the film, even when other elements feel less fully realized. There's also something to be said about how the film handles its tone. It doesn't shift dramatically between extremes. It maintains a steady, almost subdued atmosphere, even during its more intense moments. That consistency gives it a certain identity, even if it means sacrificing some emotional highs and lows along the way. By the time everything comes together, what you're left with is a film that feels deliberate in its choices, even when those choices don't fully satisfy every expectation. It knows the kind of story it wants to tell, and it sticks to that vision without trying to constantly adjust itself to meet external demands. And that, in a way, is both its strength and its limitation. It delivers a focused, controlled experience that stays true to its tone and structure. But it also leaves you wondering what might have happened if it had taken a few more risks, if it had pushed just a little further into the emotional territory it hints at, but never fully explores. And when you start digging a little deeper, beyond what's immediately visible on the surface, that's where Colombiana becomes more interesting than people often give it credit for. Because there are small, deliberate details scattered throughout the film that don't call attention to themselves, but quietly reinforce everything it's trying to say. One of the most obvious, yet still easy to overlook, is the orchid symbol Cataleya leaves behind. On paper, it feels like a simple signature, a calling card. But the more you think about it, the more layered it becomes. It's not just a mark of identity, it's a message directed at one specific person. It's her way of saying, I'm still here, I haven't forgotten. And that repetition, that consistency, turns it into something almost ritualistic. Every time it appears, it's not just a clue, it's a reminder of how long she's been carrying this with her. There's also a subtle connection between that symbol and her name, which ties back to the idea of identity being shaped by memory. The film doesn't pause to explain it or underline its importance, but it's there, quietly linking her past to her present in a way that feels intentional. It's one of those details that adds texture without interrupting the flow of the story. Another thing that stands out is how the film uses space. Cataleya is constantly moving through environments that feel controlled, but never fully safe. Apartments, hallways, hidden rooms, everything is designed to offer just enough protection without ever allowing her to relax. There's always an exit strategy, always a plan, always a sense that she's prepared to leave at any moment. That physical restlessness mirrors her internal state in a way that doesn't need to be spelled out. Even the way she interacts with objects tells you something about her. Weapons, tools, everyday items, they're all handled with the same level of precision. Nothing is casual. Nothing is accidental. It reinforces the idea that her entire life has been shaped around preparation and execution. There's no separation between who she is and what she does. Then you've got the way the film handles time. It doesn't rely on constant flashbacks to remind you of her past. Instead, it lets that past exist in the background, influencing her actions without dominating the narrative. And that choice keeps the story moving forward while still maintaining a connection to its emotional core. You're always aware of where she came from, even when the film isn't explicitly showing it. There's also an interesting restraint in how the film portrays its antagonist. Jordi Mollà plays Don Luis with a kind of understated arrogance, but the film doesn't overexpose him. You don't get a deep dive into his perspective or his motivations. He exists more as a presence than a fully developed character, which keeps the focus firmly on Cataleya's journey. And while that might seem like a limitation at first, it actually reinforces the film's perspective. This isn't his story. It's hers. He's not meant to be understood or sympathized with. He's meant to be confronted. By keeping him at a distance, the film avoids diluting that focus. Another detail that often goes unnoticed is how the film handles communication. There's very little unnecessary dialogue. Conversations are brief, functional, often carrying more meaning in what isn't said than what is. That minimalism fits the tone perfectly. These are characters who don't have the luxury of long, emotional exchanges. Everything is direct, efficient, to the point. And that extends to the pacing as well. The film doesn't linger on moments longer than it needs to, but it also doesn't rush through them. It finds this middle ground where each scene feels complete without feeling stretched. That balance is harder to achieve than it looks, especially in a genre that often prioritizes speed over clarity. From a production standpoint, you can see the influence of Luc Besson in the way everything is structured. There's a clear emphasis on visual storytelling, on letting actions and environments convey meaning, rather than relying solely on dialogue. It's a style that prioritizes mood and atmosphere, and it gives the film a distinct identity, even when the narrative itself follows familiar beats. There are also small continuity details that reward attention. The way certain locations are revisited, the way patterns repeat, the way visual motifs echo across different parts of the film. It all contributes to a sense of cohesion. Nothing feels completely random, even if not every detail is immediately obvious. And then there's the way the film handles its ending, not just in terms of plot, but in terms of tone. It doesn't shift dramatically or try to redefine itself at the last moment. It stays consistent with everything that came before, which gives the entire experience a kind of unity. Whether that's satisfying or not depends on what you're expecting, but it's undeniably deliberate. All of these elements, the symbols, the structure, the restraint, they add up to something that feels more carefully constructed than it might initially appear. It's not a film that demands deep analysis, but it rewards it. The more you pay attention, the more you start to see the thought behind the choices, even in the quieter moments that might otherwise pass unnoticed. And when you take all of that, the subtle details, the performances, the structure, and place it within the bigger picture of how audiences respond to films like this, you start to see why Colombiana has the kind of staying power it does, even without being labeled as a major blockbuster. Because success in this genre isn't always about scale. Sometimes it's about connection, about whether a film gives viewers something they can latch onto, something that feels distinct enough to stand out in a crowded space. And Colombiana, in its own controlled, understated way, does manage to carve out that space for itself. Part of that comes down to timing, but part of it also comes down to identity. It doesn't try to compete directly with the biggest films of its era. It doesn't inflate itself beyond what it is. Instead, it leans into a more focused approach, offering a story that feels contained but still impactful. And for a lot of audiences, that kind of clarity is actually refreshing. There's also the factor of rewatchability, which is something people don't always talk about when it comes to action films. This isn't a movie that relies solely on surprise. It's not built around twists that lose their impact once you know them. It's built around tone, performance, and atmosphere, all things that tend to hold up over multiple viewings. You notice different details, pick up on different nuances, and that adds to its longevity. Another reason it resonates is because of the character at its center. A film like this lives or dies on whether the audience believes in the person driving the story, and Zoe Saldaña brings enough authenticity to the role that even when the narrative leans into familiar territory, it doesn't feel empty. There's always something grounding it, something keeping it from drifting into pure spectacle. And then there's the broader appeal of the concept itself. Revenge stories, when handled with a certain level of restraint, tend to connect across different audiences. They're simple on the surface, but they tap into something deeper: loss, memory, identity. Colombiana doesn't fully explore all of those themes in a complex way, but it touches on them just enough to give the story weight. From a commercial standpoint, films like this often find their real audience over time. They might not dominate the box office in the way major franchises do, but they build a steady following. They become the kind of movies people return to, recommend, revisit on streaming platforms. And in today's landscape, that kind of long-term engagement can be just as valuable as an explosive opening weekend. There's also an argument to be made about how this film fits into the evolution of action cinema. It's part of a wave that helped reinforce the idea that you can center a story around a female protagonist without fundamentally changing the mechanics of the genre. You don't have to soften the action or reshape the narrative to fit expectations. You can tell the same kind of story, with the same level of intensity, and simply shift the perspective. And that shift matters more than it might initially seem. It opens the door for more variety, more representation, more opportunities for different kinds of stories to exist within the same framework. Colombiana doesn't push that idea to its limits, but it contributes to it in a meaningful way. At the same time, the film's relatively contained scope works in its favor when it comes to audience engagement. It doesn't require prior knowledge. It doesn't demand long-term commitment. You can step into it, experience it, and step out without feeling like you've only seen part of a larger puzzle. That accessibility makes it easier for a wide range of viewers to connect with it. And yet, despite that simplicity, there's enough beneath the surface to keep it from feeling disposable. The tone, the atmosphere, the character work, they all combine to create something that lingers just a little longer than you might expect. So when you look at why this film works, not just as a piece of entertainment, but as something that continues to hold attention over time, it really comes down to balance. It doesn't try to be everything. It doesn't overextend itself. It stays within its lane, but it commits fully to what it's doing. And in a genre that often leans toward excess, that kind of restraint can actually be its biggest advantage. And when you sit with all of that for a moment, the restraint, the tone, the performance, the way it quietly holds its identity without trying to shout over everything else, you start to understand why a film like Colombiana ends up feeling more personal than its genre might suggest. Because at the end of the day, this isn't really a story about action. The action is just the language it speaks. What it's actually exploring in a very controlled, almost distant way is what happens when a person builds their entire existence around a single, unresolved moment. And more importantly, what's left when that moment is finally confronted. There's something quietly unsettling about that idea, and the film never tries to soften it. It doesn't give you easy answers. It doesn't try to convince you that everything balances out in the end. Instead, it leaves you with that lingering sense that some paths, once taken, don't really lead anywhere. They just continue in a different form. And that's probably why the film sticks with certain viewers longer than expected. Not because it overwhelms you with spectacle, but because it leaves space. Space to think about the choices the character made, the life she constructed, and whether any of it could have gone differently. There's also a kind of honesty in the way it presents its world. It doesn't romanticize the lifestyle at the center of the story. It doesn't frame it as glamorous or aspirational. If anything, it feels isolating, controlled, limited. Even at its most visually polished, there's always that underlying sense of confinement. And that ties back to the performance at the center. Zoe Saldaña doesn't play Cataleya as someone who's thriving in this world. She plays her as someone who's functioning within it. There's a difference there that gives the character a kind of quiet weight. You're not watching someone who has embraced their role. You're watching someone who has adapted to it. When you look at the film through that lens, even its limitations start to feel more intentional. The lack of deeper exploration in certain areas, the restraint in emotional expression, the focus on progression over introspection, they all contribute to a tone that feels consistent, even if it's not always as expansive as it could be. And that consistency is what allows the film to maintain its identity from beginning to end. It doesn't shift dramatically in its final moments. It doesn't try to redefine itself or leave you with a completely different impression. It stays true to the tone it established early on, which gives the entire experience a kind of cohesion that's easy to overlook, but hard to replicate. There's also something to be said about how the film respects its audience. It doesn't over-explain. It doesn't force emotional beats. It allows you to interpret, to fill in the gaps, to decide how you feel about what you're watching. And that kind of restraint, while not always immediately satisfying, often leads to a more lasting impression. So when everything settles, what you're left with isn't just a series of action sequences or a straightforward revenge narrative. You're left with a character study that operates within the framework of an action film, using that structure to explore something a little quieter, a little more internal. And maybe that's why it continues to find its audience over time. Not because it reinvents the genre or pushes boundaries in obvious ways, but because it understands exactly what it wants to be, and it commits to that vision without hesitation. There's a kind of quiet confidence in that approach, a willingness to stay focused, to stay controlled, to let the story speak in its own way without trying to constantly prove its worth. And in a landscape where so many films feel the need to escalate or expand beyond their core idea, that kind of discipline stands out more than you might expect. It's not loud. It's not overwhelming. It doesn't demand attention, but it holds it. And sometimes, that's the more difficult thing to achieve. And what becomes even more apparent when you step back is how the film handles its thematic undercurrents without ever making them overt. Colombiana isn't interested in preaching or moralizing. It doesn't hit you over the head with lessons about justice or vengeance. Instead, it lets the story, and by extension Cataleya herself, carry the weight of those ideas naturally. The themes emerge from her actions, from the environments she moves through, and from the consequences of her decisions, rather than from exposition or dialogue. That subtlety is what gives the film a sense of maturity in an otherwise straightforward revenge narrative. And that subtlety extends into the way secondary characters are used. Every supporting player, from allies to antagonists, exists in relation to Cataleya's journey, and their roles are precisely measured to avoid cluttering the narrative. None of them feel extraneous. Each one reinforces her world, her isolation, or the stakes she faces. Even minor characters carry visual or narrative cues that help the audience grasp her priorities and the dangers surrounding her. There's a minimalist efficiency in these choices that mirrors the discipline Cataleya herself embodies. Visually, the film also leverages its environments to reinforce narrative and emotion. Urban landscapes, shadowed hallways, empty streets, these aren't just backdrops, they're reflections of her internal state. There's a kind of calculated loneliness in the way spaces are framed, emphasizing her self-imposed isolation and the constant tension she exists under. And during action sequences, the camera doesn't simply track movement. It's almost a character in itself, anticipating her choices, offering perspectives that make the audience feel aligned with her rather than observing from a distance. That perspective-based cinematography deepens immersion without ever being flashy or drawing attention to itself unnecessarily. And speaking of action, it's not just about spectacle, it's about logic and consequence. Every move she makes is grounded in preparation, skill, and necessity. There's a coherence to her abilities that makes the film's action sequences believable in a way that's often missing in the genre. It respects the intelligence of both the character and the audience. And by doing so, it reinforces the notion that Cataleya isn't invincible. She's capable, disciplined, and extremely aware of her limitations. That tension between her competence and the dangers she faces keeps viewers engaged and invested. Sound design also plays a critical role in sustaining tension and guiding emotional beats. Instead of relying on overbearing scores during every scene, the film punctuates moments with subtle audio cues, footsteps echoing in an empty corridor, a distant siren, the soft click of a gun being loaded. These small details create an undercurrent of tension that's persistent, yet unobtrusive. The music swells when needed, but it never feels manipulative. It complements rather than dominates, again reflecting the film's consistent restraint in tone. And the editing, while clean and unobtrusive, deserves mention. Each cut is deliberate, often chosen to emphasize timing, consequence, or spatial awareness during action sequences. There's a rhythm to the editing that mirrors Cataleya's own calculated movements, measured, precise, and efficient. It's a quiet artistry that supports immersion rather than distracts, which is crucial for maintaining credibility in a world that could easily slip into hyper-stylization or implausibility. There's also an understated narrative tension in how the film handles its geography. Her missions take her through multiple cities and countries, yet each location is carefully chosen for its narrative relevance rather than aesthetic variety alone. Urban centers, corporate interiors, and secluded hideouts are all more than visual textures. They serve as narrative tools that reflect her journey, challenges, and the constraints imposed by her enemies. This spatial storytelling subtly reinforces the film's central themes of strategy, survival, and precision. Moreover, the film's treatment of morality is intentionally ambiguous. Cataleya operates outside conventional ethical boundaries, yet she's not painted as a villain. The audience is asked to engage with her motives critically, to weigh justice versus revenge, and to consider whether personal retribution can coexist with the moral codes she inevitably violates. This tension isn't heavily analyzed through exposition. It's presented in action, consequence, and the quiet moments between confrontations. And that ambiguity adds layers to what might otherwise be a simple revenge story. Finally, there's the element of pacing that ties everything together. Unlike many action films that oscillate between frenzied peaks and lulls, Colombiana maintains a steady forward momentum. Every scene, whether action-heavy or contemplative, contributes to the narrative propulsion. There's a sense of inevitability in the progression, which keeps viewers engaged without feeling rushed or manipulated. That pacing, combined with the consistent tone, refined performances, and meticulous attention to environmental and narrative detail, results in a viewing experience that is coherent, satisfying, and surprisingly thoughtful for its genre. And all of these elements together, the symbolism, the visual and spatial storytelling, the deliberate pacing, the subtle moral ambiguity, and the controlled performances, culminate in a film that quietly asserts itself. It doesn't need to scream for attention or reinvent the genre. It establishes its identity in the small, intentional choices that create a cohesive, immersive experience. And that's why, even years after its release, it continues to be a film that sparks discussion, reflection, and appreciation among audiences who look beyond the surface-level action and engage with the craft underpinning it. And as you let all of that settle, what becomes truly fascinating is the interplay between Cataleya's personal journey and the broader narrative world she inhabits. Colombiana doesn't exist in isolation. It exists in dialogue with a long tradition of revenge films, female-led action movies, and the stylistic sensibilities that Luc Besson helped popularize. There's a lineage here that informs how we read the film, whether consciously or not. You can trace echoes of earlier European thrillers, the kinetic energy of modern American action, and the moral complexity of classic noir, all wrapped into a story that's ultimately very contemporary. And yet, Despite these influences, the film manages to retain a distinct voice. It's easy for films in this space to feel derivative, but Colombiana consistently asserts its identity through the careful alignment of character, visual language, and narrative tone. Cataleya's precision, her rituals, and even her silence are narrative devices that reinforce the story's focus, ensuring that the film doesn't collapse under the weight of its inspirations. It's a balancing act, and for the most part, it succeeds. Another layer worth discussing is the relationship between Cataleya and the audience. The film doesn't simply invite empathy, it invites complicity. As viewers, we are positioned to understand and, to some degree, endorse her decisions, even when they're morally questionable. That positioning is subtle, executed through cinematography, point-of-view framing, and the timing of revelation. It's a clever manipulation that never feels manipulative. It respects the intelligence of the audience, while also deepening our engagement with the character. And that engagement is further reinforced by the film's treatment of tension and suspense. The stakes are clear, but they're never overstated. Threats emerge organically from the narrative and are reinforced through spatial awareness, timing, and Cataleya's interactions with her environment. There's a logic to danger here, a calculable risk that makes each confrontation feel earned rather than arbitrary. This realism in tension, juxtaposed with stylized action, creates a compelling rhythm that keeps the viewer invested. It's also important to note how the film manages emotional resonance without overt melodrama. Moments of vulnerability, Cataleya's glimpses of doubt, hesitation, or reflection, are sparse but impactful. They're never drawn out, but they register because of the film's overall restraint. Each pause, each subtle expression, carries weight precisely because the film doesn't overuse them. And when these quieter moments intersect with the high-stakes action sequences, they amplify the impact of both, creating a layered emotional experience. Even the use of recurring motifs, like the orchid, or repeated visual patterns in her environment, functions on multiple levels. On one hand, they serve as narrative anchors, markers that track progress and remind us of her motivations. On another, they subtly comment on her psychology, reflecting patterns of obsession, control, and the cyclical nature of revenge. These motifs aren't heavy-handed. They're woven seamlessly into the narrative fabric, rewarding attentive viewers without alienating casual ones. And speaking of narrative fabric, the screenplay itself deserves acknowledgement. While it doesn't reinvent storytelling conventions, it exhibits a tight economy of structure. Each scene has a purpose, whether to advance plot, deepen character, or reinforce thematic undertones. There's no extraneous padding. Everything moves the story forward, and that disciplined construction contributes to the film's clarity and coherence. Even moments of exposition are delivered sparingly and through action or visual cues, rather than lengthy monologues, which maintains immersion and pace. Then there's the matter of visual composition and cinematography. The film consistently frames Cataleya in ways that emphasize her isolation, her meticulousness, and her agency. Whether she's navigating tight urban corridors or open landscapes, the camera positions her at the center of control, but it also acknowledges the threats surrounding her. There's a dynamic tension in every shot between vulnerability and competence, and that visual storytelling reinforces the narrative without ever resorting to verbal explanation. Costume and production design further support this intentionality. Cataleya's outfits are functional yet stylish, reflecting both practicality and personal identity. Locations are chosen for their narrative resonance, from stark urban architecture to intimate interiors that echo themes of confinement and escape. Even small props, the signature weapon, the orchid, or a personal artifact, carry symbolic weight, reinforcing character and story without overwhelming the viewer. Soundtrack and score complement these choices in subtle but meaningful ways. Rather than overpowering action with constant high-energy music, the film selectively underscores tension, emotion, and pacing. Ambient sounds, diegetic noise, and restrained musical cues create a textured auditory environment, making scenes feel alive and consistent with the film's grounded approach to action. It's an approach that rewards listening and heightens immersion, subtly reinforcing mood without drawing attention to itself. And finally, when you consider all these elements together, the deliberate pacing, the controlled action, the nuanced character work, the environmental storytelling, and the subtle emotional beats, you realize that Colombiana achieves a cohesion that is deceptively simple. On the surface, it may seem like a straightforward revenge action thriller. But beneath that surface lies a careful orchestration of elements, each contributing to a unified vision. It's a film that doesn't announce its artistry loudly, yet it earns respect through consistency, discipline, and attention to detail, making it more than just another entry in the genre. And when you let all of that coalesce, the performances, the visual composition, the narrative precision, you start to notice how Colombiana functions almost like a study in controlled chaos. Everything feels deliberate, yet it's wrapped in a kinetic energy that keeps the audience on edge. The film doesn't rely on spectacle alone. It relies on the tension between preparation and unpredictability. Cataleya's life is meticulously planned, yet the world around her is chaotic and dangerous, and that tension drives the film in a way that's both thrilling and intellectually engaging. And there's an interesting duality at play in how the film treats time. Flashbacks are minimal, but their impact is magnified. We're given just enough context to understand her motivations, but not so much that it feels like a narrative crutch. That sparseness allows viewers to project their own interpretations onto her past, which creates a more intimate connection with the character. You feel the weight of her history not because it's spelled out, but because you witness its influence on every decision, every precision move, every guarded glance. There's also a compelling economy in the dialogue. Conversations are sharp, efficient, often carrying subtext that deepens characterization without dragging the pace down. Every line has weight, either revealing information, advancing plot, or reinforcing themes. There's no filler, no small talk for the sake of realism. Every word is purposeful, contributing to a rhythm that mirrors Cataleya's controlled, measured life. This minimalistic approach extends to exposition, which is integrated seamlessly through visual storytelling and character action, rather than relying on clunky narration. And yet, despite its disciplined structure, the film is never static. Even its quietest moments hum with underlying tension. You can sense the ever-present threat lurking beneath the surface, whether it's a shadowy figure in a background shot, the distant sound of sirens, or the subtle framing of a location that suggests vulnerability. The film cultivates a constant awareness that danger is near, which maintains engagement without forcing overt suspense tactics. It's an intelligence in storytelling that's rare for its genre, where action often substitutes for substance. From a character perspective, Cataleya is fascinating because she embodies contradiction. She's precise yet emotionally volatile, disciplined yet haunted by trauma, lethal yet deeply human. The film resists turning her into a caricature or an idealized action hero. Instead, it presents her as someone forged by circumstance, whose skills are inseparable from her pain. That grounding in realism enhances audience investment. Her victories feel earned, her failures carry consequence, and her internal conflicts resonate because they're never abstract. They're rooted in the very real consequences of her environment and history. And the antagonists, while less developed, function as perfect narrative foils. They aren't simply obstacles to overcome. They represent systemic structures and moral corruption that Cataleya navigates. Their presence underscores the stakes without overshadowing the protagonist, and the tension between them and her is carefully calibrated to heighten narrative impact. Even their limited backstory and screen time are enough to establish threat and narrative momentum. Visually, the film achieves a harmony between style and function. Camera work frames Cataleya's movements with a clarity that enhances action sequences while maintaining spatial awareness, a key element often overlooked in action choreography. Shots are composed to communicate both strategy and risk, giving viewers an implicit understanding of her decisions. And when combined with precise editing, the visual storytelling becomes a language unto itself, reinforcing narrative beats without explicit explanation. Sound design complements this by anchoring action in reality. The weight of gunfire, the echo of footsteps, and the subtle layering of ambient noise all contribute to immersion. Music punctuates without overwhelming, emphasizing tension and emotion selectively. These audio cues work in tandem with visual framing to maintain consistent tone, ensuring the audience remains fully absorbed in Cataleya's world. And thematically, the film explores identity and agency in a way that feels understated yet potent. Cataleya's actions aren't just about vengeance, they're about reclaiming control in a life that was violently disrupted. The narrative subtly examines how trauma shapes identity, how obsession can become both a motivator and a prison, and how agency is negotiated in a world where every move carries consequence. These threads are woven into the story without overt exposition, allowing viewers to engage with them intuitively. By the time the film reaches its climax, all of these elements, the disciplined action, the emotional undercurrents, the visual and auditory cohesion, come together to deliver a resolution that feels earned. It's not about spectacle for spectacle's sake, it's about culmination. The film's pacing, its narrative choices, and its careful character development converge to provide a payoff that respects both the story and the audience's investment. And in the larger context of early 2010s action cinema, Colombiana stands out precisely because of this balance. It offers adrenaline and engagement, but it doesn't sacrifice subtlety or intelligence. Its careful construction, disciplined execution, and restrained yet deliberate storytelling give it a staying power that ensures it remains a point of reference in discussions about female-led action films and modern revenge narratives. The more you dissect it, the clearer it becomes that every choice, every frame, every cut, every line of dialogue, every sound cue, is designed to maintain a specific tension between clarity and ambiguity, control and chaos, action and introspection. And that meticulous orchestration is what allows Colombiana to feel cohesive, immersive, and ultimately memorable in a genre often dominated by flash and immediacy, rather than enduring craft. And when you start to step back and look at the film as a complete work, it's remarkable how much cohesion is maintained despite its inherent intensity. Colombiana doesn't need constant spectacle or over-the-top sequences to assert itself. Every scene, every movement, every beat feels intentional, almost surgical, reinforcing both the narrative and the psychological landscape of Cataleya. You can see the careful hand of direction in how sequences are constructed, how tension is built, released, and then rebuilt in ways that feel natural rather than forced. It's an artistry that quietly asserts itself without needing to shout. And speaking of the direction, Olivier Megaton demonstrates a keen understanding of pacing. The film never drags, even when it slows down to explore quieter character moments. These moments are not filler, they are essential. They give depth to Cataleya's journey, allowing the audience to breathe and process her internal conflicts. They also enhance the stakes when action does erupt, because the viewer has a stronger emotional connection to her motivations. This balance between momentum and reflection is tricky, yet Colombiana manages it with surprising consistency. Another subtle aspect worth noting is how the film treats its antagonists. They aren't merely obstacles for Cataleya to overcome, they function as mirrors to her own journey. Each antagonist presents a different facet of the world she navigates: power structures, corruption, and moral compromise. And while the film doesn't spend excessive time on their backstory, the brief insights we get are enough to understand their motives and heighten tension. This measured approach ensures the focus remains on Cataleya, while still giving the narrative a sense of depth and consequence. There's also the understated elegance in how the film handles geography and space. Locations aren't just settings, they're extensions of the story. Urban corridors, rooftop chases, and dimly lit interiors aren't merely aesthetic. They communicate strategy, constraint, and risk. The way Cataleya moves through these spaces reflects her meticulous planning and her constant awareness of danger, turning environment into a silent narrative partner. And through clever cinematography, the audience is aligned with her perspective, heightening immersion and engagement. Cinematography, in fact, deserves particular attention. The framing consistently reinforces Cataleya's psychological state. Isolated shots highlight her solitude and obsession, while wider frames during action sequences convey both scope and danger. The camera often lingers just long enough on visual cues, a shadow, a weapon, a fleeting expression, to communicate subtext without dialogue. This visual literacy enhances storytelling and allows the audience to feel more attuned to the character's internal landscape. Sound design and score further amplify this effect. Instead of relying on constant bombast, the film employs restraint. Every gunshot, footstep, or ambient noise carries weight. The score punctuates emotion selectively, enhancing tension when necessary, but never overwhelming the scene. This nuanced audio layering creates a textured soundscape that mirrors the balance between action and introspection, drawing viewers further into Cataleya's world. And then there's the moral landscape the film navigates. Cataleya's actions exist in a gray zone. She is neither a conventional hero nor a villain. The audience is invited to engage with her ethical choices critically, weighing personal vengeance against societal norms. This subtle moral ambiguity adds a layer of sophistication to what could otherwise be a straightforward action narrative. It makes her victories and losses resonate on an emotional and philosophical level, inviting discussion and reflection. The screenplay itself is another pillar of the film's strength. Dialogue is purposeful, often layered with subtext. Exposition is minimized, yet enough context is provided for the audience to follow her motivations. Every scene has a clear function, advancing plot, developing character, or reinforcing theme. This efficiency keeps the film tight and immersive, avoiding the common pitfalls of padding or unnecessary detours that plague many action thrillers. What's especially noteworthy is how all of these elements converge in the action sequences. These scenes are not chaotic set pieces designed purely for spectacle. They are extensions of character and narrative. Cataleya's movements are calculated, each strike or maneuver informed by her skill, intelligence, and emotional state. The tension is tangible because it arises from an understandable risk framework. The audience knows that each action carries potential consequence. This blend of realism and cinematic style elevates the sequences beyond mere excitement, giving them narrative and emotional weight. And as you reflect on the film's overall tone, there's a consistency that ties everything together. From the cinematography to the performances, from pacing to moral ambiguity, everything aligns to create a cohesive vision. It's rare to see such a unified approach in a film of this genre, where the temptation is often to prioritize spectacle over substance. Colombiana, by contrast, shows how disciplined storytelling, careful direction, and focused character work can produce a thrilling, emotionally resonant experience without resorting to excess. Finally, it's worth noting the lasting impression of the film. It doesn't scream for attention, and it isn't flashy for the sake of flash. Yet its impact endures because it trusts its audience, respects its narrative, and delivers a character-driven experience that resonates beyond the immediate thrill. The subtlety, control, and careful orchestration of story, performance, and style make Colombiana a quietly compelling piece of cinema, one that continues to engage, intrigue, and reward viewers who look beyond surface-level action to appreciate the craft beneath. And if we start considering the legacy of Colombiana within the broader landscape of action cinema, it becomes even more interesting. The film occupies a space that's often underexplored: female-led, emotionally grounded, and methodically plotted action films. In a genre historically dominated by male protagonists and over-the-top spectacle, Colombiana demonstrates that a story centered on a woman with agency, skill, and personal motivation can be just as, if not more, compelling. Cataleya isn't a token character. She is the narrative engine, driving every beat, every conflict, every confrontation. That focus challenges genre conventions and subtly shifts expectations for what action cinema can deliver. And while the film does wear some of its influences on its sleeve, elements reminiscent of Luc Besson's earlier works, European thrillers, and modern Hollywood action, it never feels derivative. Instead, it synthesizes these influences into a coherent style that's recognizably its own. It's a careful negotiation of homage and originality. Every stylistic choice, from shot composition to pacing, from action choreography to sound design, reflects intention rather than imitation. And that level of deliberation is rare in genre films, where formula often supersedes craft. The psychological dimension of Cataleya's journey also stands out. Revenge films can sometimes reduce their protagonists to mere instruments of action. But here, every act of violence carries weight. The audience isn't just witnessing spectacle, they're witnessing a character's negotiation with trauma, obsession, and moral ambiguity. That psychological depth transforms standard action beats into emotionally charged moments. For instance, a rooftop confrontation isn't simply a thrilling sequence. It's also an exploration of her calculated risk-taking, her awareness of consequence, and her unspoken vulnerabilities. These layers enrich the experience without slowing down the narrative. And the editing choices support this meticulous attention to character and tension. Every cut feels purposeful. There's a rhythm that mirrors Cataleya's precision, deliberate, controlled, and attentive to consequence. Quick cuts are reserved for moments of genuine chaos, while slower, lingering frames emphasize strategy and anticipation. This approach allows the audience to experience both the exhilaration of action and the careful intelligence behind it. The result is a series of sequences that feel visceral and authentic, rather than mechanical or choreographed purely for visual appeal. Even in quieter, non-action sequences, the film maintains its control over tone and pacing. Scenes that explore Cataleya's personal reflections, her brief interactions with allies, or her solitude, are crafted to reinforce her emotional state. These moments are deliberately sparse, yet they carry significant narrative weight. They remind viewers that she is not just a machine of vengeance, but a person shaped by history, environment, and personal loss. This careful oscillation between tension and introspection enriches the narrative texture and prevents the film from becoming monotonous, even amidst repeated action set pieces. Thematically, the film explores identity and agency in a nuanced way. Cataleya's quest is deeply personal, yet it raises broader questions about morality, consequence, and justice. Her actions are morally ambiguous, yet the film frames them in a way that encourages audience engagement rather than judgment. Viewers are invited to consider what drives her, to understand her choices, and to reflect on the nature of vengeance itself. It's a subtle but effective approach that elevates the narrative beyond the trappings of conventional action cinema. Visually, Colombiana is consistently polished without being ostentatious. Production design, costuming, and location choices all serve narrative purposes. Cataleya's wardrobe is practical, reflecting her functional mindset, but it also conveys personality. Environments are carefully curated to amplify tension or highlight strategic considerations, turning urban landscapes, corporate offices, and secluded hideouts into narrative tools rather than mere backdrops. Even minor visual motifs like the orchid or the recurring glimpses of certain settings reinforce character psychology and narrative continuity. Sound design further amplifies the film's subtlety. Gunfire, footsteps, and environmental sounds are layered in a way that creates spatial awareness and tension without overwhelming the viewer. The selective use of music underscores emotional or narrative peaks, enhancing impact without resorting to heavy-handed cues. The combined audio-visual approach ensures that viewers remain immersed in the story world, experiencing tension, anticipation, and catharsis in tandem. Performance-wise, Cataleya's portrayal is anchored by a balance of intensity and restraint. Her emotional range is conveyed through subtle expression, body language, and timing, rather than exposition-heavy dialogue. This choice ensures the character feels grounded, believable, and compelling. Supporting performances, though less central, are calibrated to reinforce stakes and tension without overshadowing her journey. This equilibrium ensures narrative focus remains sharp while creating a believable, lived-in world. Ultimately, the film's strength lies in its cohesion. Every element, Performance, direction, editing, sound design, production design, cinematography, and narrative structure works together to create a unified vision. It's a rare example of disciplined storytelling in action cinema, where spectacle is carefully balanced with psychological and thematic depth. By the time the story reaches its conclusion, the audience is not merely entertained, but also engaged intellectually and emotionally, invested in Cataleya's journey and the consequences she navigates. Colombiana, through this combination of precise action, thematic resonance, and disciplined execution, achieves a level of craft that elevates it above many contemporaries in the revenge thriller genre. Its lasting appeal is a testament to the deliberate choices made at every level, from scripting to performance, from editing to sound design, and from visual composition to thematic layering. This is a film that rewards attention, reflection, and emotional engagement, offering a rich, multi-dimensional experience far beyond the surface thrills of conventional action cinema. It's that quiet orchestration of chaos, tension, and human experience that ensures the film continues to resonate. Even years after release, it stands as a reference point for what's possible when action cinema combines discipline, narrative intelligence, and emotional resonance. Colombiana proves that a story driven by a singular, complex character, executed with intention and precision, can leave a lasting impact, both as entertainment and as an example of thoughtful genre filmmaking. And reflecting on all these elements together, what really cements Colombiana as a standout is how it marries personal narrative with cinematic spectacle. The film doesn't treat action as an end in itself. Every sequence, chase, or confrontation serves the dual purpose of thrilling the audience and deepening our understanding of Cataleya's psyche. That's where the film's intelligence lies, in its ability to make visceral moments feel narratively and emotionally earned, rather than arbitrary or gratuitous. It's a fine line, and Colombiana walks it with a precision that mirrors its protagonist's own calculated movements. And this approach extends to the interplay between past and present within the film. Cataleya's childhood trauma and the murder of her family aren't just plot devices. They form the lens through which we interpret every subsequent decision she makes. These backstory elements are conveyed sparingly, yet effectively, often through visual shorthand or contextual cues, rather than heavy exposition. The audience doesn't just observe her past, they feel its imprint on every action she takes, making her choices resonate with authenticity and weight. Another fascinating dimension is how the film engages with themes of control and autonomy. Cataleya operates in a world dominated by powerful, often corrupt forces, yet she constantly seeks to reclaim agency within that environment. Her meticulous planning, tactical awareness, and moral reasoning reflect a desire not only for revenge, but for mastery over her own narrative. In a genre frequently concerned with external conflict, Colombiana foregrounds internal struggle, reminding viewers that the most compelling action often arises from characters asserting control over their own lives amid chaos. The cinematography reinforces this theme of control. The camera frequently aligns with Cataleya's perspective, allowing the audience to anticipate threats, witness strategy unfold, and understand spatial dynamics. Yet, the framing also emphasizes her vulnerability. She is precise and competent, but the world remains unpredictable and dangerous. This duality creates a visual tension that parallels the narrative stakes, ensuring that the film's aesthetic choices are inseparable from its storytelling intentions. And within these visual and narrative strategies lies a commitment to realism. Action sequences are choreographed to reflect plausible movement, weapon handling, and tactical choices. There's an underlying logic to each confrontation, each escape, each pursuit. This attention to detail differentiates Colombiana from more fantastical action films, where the spectacle can overshadow coherence. Here, the plausibility enhances tension and immersion, allowing viewers to invest in both the physical stakes and the emotional stakes simultaneously. The score and sound design work in tandem with this realism. Music is used judiciously, highlighting emotional beats or amplifying suspense only when necessary. Environmental sounds, footsteps, distant traffic, the click of a weapon, anchor scenes in reality, creating an auditory space that mirrors the visual clarity and narrative precision. The combined effect is an immersive sensory experience that complements the film's psychological and thematic concerns. And yet, despite all this control and deliberation, the film retains a sense of unpredictability. Cataleya's world is dangerous precisely because outcomes are uncertain, even for someone as skilled as she is. This uncertainty keeps the audience engaged, fostering anticipation and emotional investment without resorting to contrived twists or artificial tension. The stakes feel genuine because the narrative has established consistent rules and consequences, allowing suspense to emerge naturally from the story, rather than from forced manipulations. Cataleya herself embodies this balance between discipline and risk. Her methodical nature contrasts with the chaos around her, yet her emotional impulses occasionally disrupt her carefully constructed plans. These moments of human vulnerability enhance her relatability, reminding viewers that beneath the precision lies a person shaped by trauma, loyalty, and desire for justice. The film's refusal to simplify her character into a one-dimensional archetype is a major factor in its enduring appeal. Supporting characters, while not as fully developed, are used strategically to illuminate aspects of Cataleya's world and personality. Allies, antagonists, and peripheral figures all serve to contextualize her journey, highlight stakes, and reinforce thematic motifs. Even brief interactions provide narrative weight, emphasizing that the world around Cataleya is complex, morally ambiguous, and consequential. And in looking at the broader narrative structure, the screenplay demonstrates remarkable economy and focus. Every scene, every line of dialogue, every action beat is carefully calibrated. There is no superfluous exposition, no padding to extend runtime. Even quieter scenes contribute to character development, thematic resonance, or plot advancement. This disciplined construction ensures that momentum is maintained without sacrificing depth, a delicate balance that many films in the revenge action genre fail to achieve. By the time the film reaches its climax, all of these threads, emotional, narrative, thematic, and aesthetic, converge. The resolution feels earned not only in terms of plot, but in terms of character growth and psychological closure. The audience has been fully invested, having witnessed Cataleya's meticulous preparation, moral negotiation, and emotional journey. The payoff resonates because it's grounded in consistent logic and character motivation, rather than relying solely on spectacle or shock value. Ultimately, the lasting impression of Colombiana is that it exemplifies how action cinema can be both thrilling and thoughtful. It respects its audience's intelligence, prioritizes character depth alongside kinetic energy, and demonstrates the narrative and emotional potential of the genre. Through meticulous direction, disciplined storytelling, and nuanced performance, the film achieves a synthesis of excitement, reflection, and resonance. GK continues to distinguish it within the action revenge canon. Colombiana reminds viewers that precision, deliberation, and emotional and DK intelligence can elevate genre filmmaking. Its impact persists not because of flashy set pieces alone, but because of the careful orchestration of every cinematic element. Performance, direction, visual language, sound design, and narrative structure into a coherent, immersive, and emotionally resonant experience. In the landscape of female-led action thrillers, it remains a benchmark, demonstrating that intensity and depth need not be mutually exclusive, and that a meticulously crafted story can resonate long after the final credits roll. And reflecting on all these elements together, what really cements Colombiana as a standout is how it marries personal narrative with cinematic spectacle. The film doesn't treat action as an end in itself. Every sequence, chase, or confrontation serves the dual purpose of thrilling the audience and deepening our understanding of Cataleya's psyche. That's where the film's intelligence lies, in its ability to make visceral moments feel narratively and emotionally earned, rather than arbitrary or gratuitous. It's a fine line, and Colombiana walks it with a precision that mirrors its protagonist's own calculated movements. And this approach extends to the interplay between past and present within the film. Cataleya's childhood trauma and the murder of her family aren't just plot devices. They form the lens through which we interpret every subsequent decision she makes. These backstory elements are conveyed sparingly yet effectively, often through visual shorthand or contextual cues rather than heavy exposition. The audience doesn't just observe her past, they feel its imprint on every action she takes, making her choices resonate with authenticity and weight. Another fascinating dimension is how the film engages with themes of control and autonomy. Cataleya operates in a world dominated by powerful, often corrupt forces, yet she constantly seeks to reclaim agency within that environment. Her meticulous planning, tactical awareness, and moral reasoning reflect a desire not only for revenge, but for mastery over her own narrative. In a genre frequently concerned with external conflict, Colombiana foregrounds internal struggle, reminding viewers that the most compelling action often arises from characters asserting control over their own lives amid chaos. The cinematography reinforces this theme of control. The camera frequently aligns with Cataleya's perspective, allowing the audience to anticipate threats, witness strategy unfold, and understand spatial dynamics. Yet, the framing also emphasizes her vulnerability. She is precise and competent, but the world remains unpredictable and dangerous. This duality creates a visual tension that parallels the narrative stakes, ensuring that the film's aesthetic choices are inseparable from its storytelling intentions. And within these visual and narrative strategies lies a commitment to realism. Action sequences are choreographed to reflect plausible movement, weapon handling, and tactical choices. There's an underlying logic to each confrontation, each escape, each pursuit. This attention to detail differentiates Colombiana from more fantastical action films, where the spectacle can overshadow coherence. Here, the plausibility enhances tension and immersion, allowing viewers to invest in both the physical stakes and the emotional stakes simultaneously. The score and sound design work in tandem with this realism. Music is used judiciously, highlighting emotional beats or amplifying suspense only when necessary. Environmental sounds, footsteps, distant traffic, the click of a weapon, anchor scenes in reality, creating an auditory space that mirrors the visual clarity and narrative precision. The combined effect is an immersive sensory experience that complements the film's psychological and thematic concerns. And yet, despite all this control and deliberation, the film retains a sense of unpredictability. Cataleya's world is dangerous precisely because outcomes are uncertain, even for someone as skilled as she is. This uncertainty keeps the audience engaged, fostering anticipation and emotional investment, without resorting to contrived twists or artificial tension. The stakes feel genuine because the narrative has established consistent rules and consequences, allowing suspense to emerge naturally from the story, rather than from forced manipulations. Cataleya herself embodies this balance between discipline and risk. Her methodical nature contrasts with the chaos around her, yet her emotional impulses occasionally disrupt her carefully constructed plans. These moments of human vulnerability enhance her relatability, reminding viewers that beneath the precision lies a person shaped by trauma, loyalty, and desire for justice. The film's refusal to simplify her character into a one-dimensional archetype is a major factor in its enduring appeal. Supporting characters, while not as fully developed, are used strategically to illuminate aspects of Cataleya's world and personality. Allies, antagonists, and peripheral figures all serve to contextualize her journey, highlight stakes, and reinforce thematic motifs. Even brief interactions provide narrative weight, emphasizing that the world around Cataleya is complex, morally ambiguous, and consequential. And in looking at the broader narrative structure, the screenplay demonstrates remarkable economy and focus. Every scene, every line of dialogue, every action beat is carefully calibrated. There is no superfluous exposition, no padding to extend runtime. Even quieter scenes contribute to character development, thematic resonance, or plot advancement. This disciplined construction ensures that momentum is maintained without sacrificing depth, a delicate balance that many films in the revenge action genre fail to achieve. By the time the film reaches its climax, all of these threads, emotional, narrative, thematic, and aesthetic, converge. The resolution feels earned not only in terms of plot, but in terms of character growth and psychological closure. The audience has been fully invested, having witnessed Cataleya's meticulous preparation, moral negotiation, and emotional journey. The payoff resonates because it's grounded in consistent logic and character motivation, rather than relying solely on spectacle or shock value. Ultimately, the lasting impression of Colombiana is that it exemplifies how action cinema can be both thrilling and thoughtful. It respects its audience's intelligence, prioritizes character depth alongside kinetic energy, and demonstrates the narrative and emotional potential of the genre. Through meticulous direction, disciplined storytelling, and nuanced performance, the film achieves a synthesis of excitement, reflection, and resonance that continues to distinguish it within the action revenge canon. Colombiana reminds viewers that precision, deliberation, and emotional intelligence can elevate genre filmmaking. Its impact persists not because of flashy set pieces alone, but because of the careful orchestration of every cinematic element. Performance, direction, visual language, sound design, and narrative structure into a coherent, immersive, and emotionally resonant experience. In the landscape of female-led action thrillers, it remains a benchmark, demonstrating that intensity and depth need not be mutually exclusive, and that a meticulously crafted story can resonate long after the final credits roll.